Hello, everyone. Caleb Masters from thecinematropolis.com here, and I'm here with a special little micro review of A Complete Unknown. This is a film that is based on Bob Dylan, specifically his life between the years of 1961 and 1965. The film is directed by James Mangold and stars Timothy Chalamet as Bob Dylan, Edward Norton as Pete Seeger, Elle Fanning as Sylvia Russo, and Monica Barbaro as Joan Bates. A Complete Unknown opens on Christmas Day, so it's that or Nosferatu are the two big new releases that day. So let me tell you a little bit more about the film according to IMDb. So the film is described as, at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, a young Bob Dylan shakes up his act on the folk music scene by going electric and sirening rock as the voice of generation defining one of the most transformative moments in the 20th century of music. So the film is co-written and directed by James Mangold, as I mentioned a moment ago, and he's really no stranger to this specific genre or subgenre, I should say, and this is the musician biopic. He also co-wrote 2003's critical and box office hit Walk the Line. That's the Johnny Cash biopic starring Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon. And even though he's successfully dabbled in other historical dramas, such as I like to call it 2019's Dad movie of the year, Ford versus Ferrari, his return to this specific subgenre is an interesting and perhaps very challenging choice for him. So a little more context here before I actually get to my review. The formula behind the musical biopic has, by and large, really become stale and rote. It's been done to death. There are so many films that have followed a very similar formula as Walk the Line. I'm thinking, of course, about Ray, Bohemian Rhapsody, Straight Outta Compton, Jersey Boys, Respect. Those are just a few. There are dozens more of them out there that you can find just by looking up the genre. And I would even say Walk the Line, though being the best version of that, is also very much playing into so many tropes about, I had a rough childhood. Oh, my dad thought the wrong kid died. I'm super successful, and now I'm into drugs, and now I'm spiraling, and I've got to have my wife to lift me up out of this dark place. So again, that's sort of a very standard formula that Hollywood is very well aware of. So well aware of, there have actually been two very notable parodies of this specific subgenre of the musician biopic. Most notably, or most recently, I should say, is Weird. That is the Weird Al biopic starring Daniel Radcliffe. And the other one, a little older, 2007, Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox Story. These are both satires that are sending off that formula, which has, since their release, really made it hard to take these sorts of musical biopics as seriously. So keeping all of this in mind, the challenge for James Mangold is to return to this genre to attempt another good old-fashioned musician biopic. This is a significant choice, a really unique challenge. It's sort of like going back to your hometown and showing people that you still got it. So I think the big question on my mind going into A Complete Unknown is, does the film succumb to those cringeworthy tropes like I mentioned, the wrong kid died, or does it provide a compelling story about the life of Bob Dylan that sort of blazes its own path that's separate from that formula? So just to get into my overall thoughts here, I think this is a very, very good film that is smart and fortunately avoids falling into those traps of the formula that I just mentioned for, I would say, two main reasons. First reason, the film focuses on a very specific chapter of Bob Dylan's life. So like I said, 1961 to 1965. This is sort of when he's making his break and eventually, towards the end of the film, makes the switch to full electric. This is a story about his early career instead of trying to tell a whole nuts and bolts story about, everything that Bob Dylan has ever experienced. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This film goes out of its way to not tell you all of the details about Bob Dylan's life, why he's making decisions, why he is so anti-system. They don't really get into any of that, which in this case, I think is a feature. So that's reason number one that I think it sort of avoids those common tropes. And number two is simply that the beats of this specific story, they're less about Bob Dylan sort of overcoming demons or internal demons. Think like the Johnny Cash or the Ray, those movies where he's battling drugs, alcoholism, womanizing, what have you. This film is more about this very specific moment in time and why and how his choice to switch from the more traditional folk music analog to full electric really changed the trajectory of folk music. So the story beats and idea driving the narrative are fundamentally different and more focused on what most biopics think of as a whole life. Why is this person this way? What are all of their greatest hits? We get a lot of Bob Dylan's hits in this film, but it is by no means doing the same thing as those films I mentioned a moment ago. Another big question on everyone's mind is, how good is Timothée Chalamet? Can he pull off Bob Dylan? Bob Dylan has a very distinct and iconic voice, and I'm here to tell you that I think that Timothée Chalamet does a very, very good job. He continues to prove that he's one of the most talented performers emerging from a sort of a new generation of movie stars that also includes people like Sydney Sweeney, Zendaya, and a number of others that you can look out there, Jacob Elordi being another one. I will say personally, I found his voice especially in the first half, tended to slide a little bit more into I'm doing a Bob Dylan impression from time to time. But overall, if we take the performance as a whole, I think he really gets lost in the performance, specifically in the second half of the film, I would say. He's also very good as a musician. Now, if you are a lifelong Bob Dylan fan, it's probably going to take a moment to adjust to the fact that you're like, ooh, that's not Bob Dylan's voice quite. That's Timothée Chalamet playing Bob Dylan, singing the song. So a little bit of adjustment, but overall, I think that's a high order for someone to step into this very specific role and being able to sing. So again, Timothée Chalamet, very, very good. Oscar qualifying, well, we'll talk about that in a moment. My actual favorite performance, it was very unexpected, was Edward Norton as Pete Seeger. And the reason I like this is because he's bringing a unique sensitivity and sort of folky charm that I don't feel like I've seen from him in the past. This is a very different type of role than what I'm used to seeing Edward Norton in. And I just think he's clearly really building this bridge and helping me understand what is it about folk music that people originally fell in love with when the genre emerged in this grassroots movement, and how did Bob Dylan reshape it in his own image in a lot of ways. And Pete Seeger sort of representing this sort of old guard who was very invested in protecting folk music, along with Woody Guthrie, who plays a very small bit role in this film as well. So I would just say at the end of the day, what A Complete Unknown does best is explore who Bob Dylan was in that very specific moment of his life without getting to any of the details about what brought him to that point. I don't need an origin story here. I am simply watching an episode in the life of Bob Dylan. I'm not getting the whole story. And to some that might sound like a downside, but I actually think by doing that, you're able to identify key characteristics about him that made him really likable and attractive to a lot of people in that specific time frame in the 60s and into the early 70s. I would say that the music overall is very good. It's very nostalgic. I would consider myself a casual Bob Dylan fan. Fan's a strong word. I like his music, but I don't have any of his music on my shelf necessarily. I do admire the songs. I find them quite powerful and often poetic. And what this movie does really well is both diegetically and non-diegetically plays songs from his repertoire that really, for me, took me way back to that very first time I listened to those songs, which, is nostalgic, feels like a warm hug, even when in the context of the movie, like maybe it's not quite so happy. So to answer the question, can James Mangold come back to this genre and deliver another great musician biopic, despite the fact that the genre has really become tired and James Mangold himself playing a role in that? Well, I would say this is a mostly successful return to that genre. So I have to give it to you, James Mangold. I never really had too many doubts. I'm a big fan of most of his films. But, got to give it off to James Mangold for smartly sidestepping, not just doing the thing he already did really well before, but finding a different avenue into telling a story using some of the same sorts of tropes in a new, more nuanced way, I would argue. Another thing I want to note here before we wrap up the review is this film, A Complete Unknown, is quickly shaping up as an Oscar contender. And though I will say I did really enjoy my time with the film, and I admired quite a lot about it, giving it the Best Picture, I guess maybe a nomination, but definitely the award, or giving Timothée Chalamet Best Lead Actor, that feels like a little bit of an over-appraisal to me. I really like what I'm seeing here, but in terms of movies that really are bold and stand out and do something new and inventive and different, I don't really think this movie is quite there. I think it's very solid, not groundbreaking, not innovative. It's not making me really rethink Bob Dylan much. It is, helping me appreciate his music a bit more. I would say it's not as nuanced as the fictional, another movie about folk music, Inside Llewyn Davis. It's certainly not as groundbreaking as Walk the Line. And it's not even Timothée Chalamet's best performance in the last 5 years, I don't think. It's simply a very good and surprisingly fresh take on a very familiar genre featuring one of history's most beloved musicians. Is it one of this year's best movies? I don't think so. It's not going to be in my top 10. I know it's really starting to rack up those awards nominations and showing up on some folks' lists. This is not going to be top for me this year, but I did like it quite a bit. So overall, how would I recommend this film? Well, if I'm going to go on the scale that we use on the Cinematic Schematic podcast, I'm going to give this a solid B. Or if you're a Bob Dylan fan, maybe go as far as giving it a B plus. I think there's a lot to like if you have that emotional connection, that nostalgia, and that affection for Bob Dylan as a musician. If that music has meant something to you at some point in your life, I think you're really going to find a lot to like and maybe even love with this film. If you're a fan of historical dramas, this film does capture a moment in time in the early 60s that I also thought was really well done in terms of sort of establishing the time, the place, the politics of the era that sort of really inspired and shaped Bob Dylan's sort of like anti-fascist ideas into his songs. So I think all of that is very present and very good. So if you're a fan of historical dramas or Bob Dylan, I think there's a lot to like here. I guess if you're a fan of Timothée Chalamet, show up just because he's pretty good. Otherwise, I don't really know that this is a film that you need to rush out to the theater and check out. If you're not really connected to any of those things, Bob Dylan, the historical genre, or Timothée Chalamet, this is simply going to feel like an old-fashioned drama that maybe doesn't have quite the oomph from that nostalgia. It's going to push you over into really feeling and jiving with the movie. But if you are in that group, I would say come Christmas Day or during the Christmas season, take the family out to the theater, take your parents, your grandparents, maybe if you're trying to introduce some kids to Bob Dylan, I say kids, more like teenagers, probably the older kids. This is worth your time. Again, this film opens on Christmas Day. I do recommend it. Check it out. Thanks so much for tuning into today's quick review. You can learn more at the cinematropolis.com. We have lots of reviews, including our podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, and review column from LaRon Chapman, Real Insights with LaRon over there. It's your home to thoughtful conversations on film. You can hit us up on Facebook at facebook.com/The Cinematropolis or on Instagram at The Cinematrop, or you can even email us at thecinemetropolis@gmail.com with your thoughts on the film. So without further ado, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone, and I'll catch you at the movies.